The decline of the Yuan. In his later years, Kublai embarked on several foreign adventures. The most significant of these were his two attempted invasions of Japan. In 1268, Kublai sent emissaries to Japan to demand submission and tribute. The shogun sent away the emissaries without giving a response. Subsequent efforts were rebuffed, and Kublai began to make preparations for the invasion of the island nation. 1,000 Korean ships were prepared and 23,000 troops were assembled for the invasion. Embarking from Korea, the army landed in Hakata Bay. Opposing the force were 6,000 samurai, whom the shogun had assembled. Initially, the Mongols got the upper hand, but a chance typhoon scattered the Mongol fleet, killing many of them and ending the invasion. Annoyed and undeterred, Kublai tried the diplomatic route again. This time, however, the ambassadors were beheaded by the shogun, which always provoked a harsh retaliation from the Mongols. Kublai was now more determined than ever to bring the Japanese to heel. He ordered the construction of 1,000 ships from Korea and 3,500 from the recently conquered Yuan Dynasty, and planned a two-pronged assault with a force of 150,000 troops. Rushing to meet Kublai's demands, many of the Chinese ships were poorly made, though. The Japanese, too, had constructed some fortifications along the shore. In May of 1281, the Mongols landed. This time they were able to make some inroads, but the Japanese were able to frustrate and harass them with fire ships. A 2-month stalemate ensued. Unfortunately for the Mongols, history repeated itself, but on a larger scale, as a great typhoon destroyed much of the fleet and stopped the invasion once again. The Japanese interpreted the typhoons that spared their island twice as supernatural events. They called them the kamikaze, or the divine wind. In terms of manpower, cost, and material, the invasion of Japan was a disaster. Kublai, true to his Mongol roots though, sought to expand in other directions. In 1279, he invaded the kingdom of Pagan in modern-day Myanmar. Here again, though, the Mongols were not fighting on their preferred steppe terrain. The jungles of Burma proved to be less than ideal terrain for their accustomed cavalry charges. The king of Pagan also possessed a force of mounted warriors on elephants, and the elephants tended to spook the Mongol horses. After some inconclusive fighting, the Mongols settled for a tribute agreement from the king of Pagan and had to withdraw. Likewise, in 1281, Kublai attempted to invade Champa, a kingdom in modern-day southern Vietnam, and Annam, a kingdom in modern-day northern Vietnam, who had both harbored some of the Song loyalists. The Mongols found themselves able to take the cities of Vietnam relatively easily, but the Vietnamese courts simply retreated to the surrounding jungles and waged a guerrilla war. Here, once again, the Mongols were fighting on terrain that was less than ideal. The humid conditions began to destroy the health of the Mongols and their horses, as tropical disease ran through their camps. Once again, Kublai had to settle for less than total victory and settled for tribute. Once again, Kublai tried another invasion, this time the island of Java in modern-day Indonesia. This campaign, too, ended in disaster and disappointment in 1292. Kublai faced a more serious threat from Central Asia. His cousin Kaidu of the Ogadyad branch of the Mongol Empire declared war and invaded Yuan territories in 1287. While Kaidu was unable to threaten the Yuan heartland, Kublai could not dislodge him from western China, and he remained a thorn in the side of the Yuan. In 1281, Kublai lost his beloved wife and companion, Chabi. She had been one of his closest advisors, and with her death, he withdrew more from direct rule from his kingdom. His losses were further compounded 4 years later, when he lost his favorite son and heir, Chenchin. Thus, many of his projects and his personal life were marked by disappointment in his later years. Increasingly, Kublai turned to alcohol and food. He grew very stout and afflicted with gout. As a result of his declining health, he finally died in 1294. Kublai had left a great empire behind, but also some unresolved issues. Well, he had had the creative genius to meld steppe nomadic traditions and Chinese agrarian civilization together. His successors lacked his abilities. One issue is, what type of empire was the Yuan? Was it going to pursue a patrimonial, feudal type of system like the Mongols traditionally had, where the empire was seen as more of a family inheritance, with each member entitled to part of it and ruling it jointly? Or was it going to be a bureaucratic monarchy in the Chinese manner, with centralized power and trained civil servants? Kublai had set up a system where different groups were given more or less power based on ethnicity. The social and legal hierarchy placed Mongols at the top, Central Asians below them still Northern Chinese, and finally at the bottom, Southern Chinese. Was this system desirable? Or should these barriers be broken down and individuals allowed to rise or fall based on merit? Finally, another question remained. How should succession be determined? Should it be done in the Mongol fashion, at a Kurultai, where all members of the family are given a voice? Or should it be based on Chinese ideals of primogeniture? These were hard questions to answer, and unfortunately for the Yuan, they were never successfully able to deal with them. In the 38 years between the death of Kublai in 1284 and the beginning of the reign of Togan Temur, the last emperor in 1332, the Yuan Dynasty had 9 different emperors. Ruling for an average of 4.3 years, 6 came to the throne in disputed situations, and 2 were murdered while on the throne. These were less than ideal conditions for an empire that was relatively new and dominating a population many times its size. One of the reasons for some of the short reigns was court factionalism between pro-Mongolian and pro-Chinese factions. Some emperors, like Kishan, favored Mongol elements in his court. He tended to disregard the advice of bureaucrats and showered favors on his kinsmen and followers. Others, like Ayur Barwada, tended to favor Chinese culture, and even reinstituted the Confucian examination system, which had been disbanded by Kublai. This was an important step because the examination system was the route to high office, and reinstating it allowed Chinese to rise into positions of high government. The Yuan dynasty was perpetually short of money. This was the case going all the way back to Kublai's failed foreign campaigns. Spending money was critical, though. It was one of the ways the loyalty of important individuals was secured. Spending money in this manner meant that other things like infrastructure and defense could not be properly funded, though, or that taxes would have to be raised, which was never popular. Some more Confucian-minded emperors, like Ayur Barwada, slashed spending on the princes and nobles, which was good for the budget, but bad for the princes and nobles, who had Ayur Barwada killed. Going over to the Chinese bureaucratic tradition had some drawbacks too. As the bureaucracy grew, it tended to gain more and more power, especially as factional fighting and murder led to younger candidates being put on the throne. Soon, the ministers were calling all the shots, and the last few Yuan emperors were little more than puppets. Across the Eurasian continent, the 14th century seems to have been a time of unprecedented natural disasters. There were unusually cold, wet temperatures, and floods, famines, plagues, and civil unrest seem to have defined the century. China was hit by some of the worst flooding in its history. The Yellow River in particular swelled to flood stage and broke its dikes, killing millions. Remember that infrastructure that we neglected. Yeah, we're looking at you, Mongol princes. As the Yuan Dynasty got further and further removed from its steppe nomadic traditions, the military effectiveness of the Mongol warriors, the mainstay of the dynasty's power, began to decline. The Mongols' army's prowess in battle was as much about lifestyle as it was about weapons and tactics. The men who lived on the steppe needed to be hard because the steppe was hard. Life in the saddle, blisteringly cold winters, eking out a living. These conditions were hard to reproduce in southern China, where there wasn't normally very much of a threat, and you got your rice rations delivered to you regularly. As such, the Mongol army lost its edge. This was a bad time to be losing your edge militarily, since the Yuan were going to be needing their army more than ever. As the Yuan dynasty was racked by civil wars between court officials, local provincial leaders had taken the opportunity to assume more and more control over their territories, until they took so much control that they were essentially independent warlords. Furthermore, now that their livelihoods were destroyed, many of the displaced flood victims turned to banditry to make ends meet. Finally, to many Chinese, with the rebellions, the floods, the corruption, it looked like the mandate of heaven was passing from the Yuan. Some even believed the apocalypse was at hand. The biggest and the most dangerous of the rebellions were religious, as fanatical Buddhist millenarian sects, known as the Red Turbans, believed the end of the world was coming. Large swaths of the country were subsumed into turmoil by such rebel groups. Zhu Yuanzhang was born among the peasants in modern-day Anhui province. He was left parentless during his adolescence. He supported himself by working at a Buddhist temple, and as a young man joined and fought for the Red Turbans. His early life allowed him to identify with the desperately poor peasants who were suffering. His adolescence gave him insight into the religious yearnings of many of the rebels, and his experience with the Red Turbans gave him the military skills he would need. Zhu broke away from the Red Turbans and founded his own rebel group that was able to unite many of the disparate elements across the country. And in 1368, Zhu was able to drive the Yuan court into Mongolia and proclaim himself emperor of the new Ming dynasty.